Good evening, dear friends. I'm Cynthia Hoven, and this is our continuing series on the journey from Easter to Whitsun, in which we're taking an honestly and courageously deep dive into the mysteries of death and resurrection from the perspective of esoteric Christianity. So I thank you very much for taking part of this, and I behold this for you and also for the planet to be able to talk about and place these considerations into the digital world where we are a presence in a world that also carries a lot of chaos. So, in a Manichaean sort of way, here we are. Welcome. So, this is the fourth evening, and it is now 25 days since Easter Sunday. And if you are familiar with the journey of the Easter season, you know that we speak of 40 days from the time of Easter Sunday, the resurrection, until the little known but very important festival of Ascension. And so we're spanning this amount of time to begin with. And then after Ascension, it's another 7 days, 8, 9 days, 10 days until the festival of Whitsun or Pentecost. We are going to take a break next week that has been on your schedule since the beginning, so that we will have had a total of 4 talks from Easter until now. The next talk will be actually on the feast day of Ascension. So we'll give a lot of consideration on that day to what Ascension is and to the upcoming festival of Pentecost or Whitsun. And then after the Ascension talk, we'll have one more on the Thursday before Whitsunday. So what are we going to accomplish today? We're going to look a little bit more deeply into what was happening in the time between the death, the resurrection, and the Ascension Festival. And we're going to look at that primarily from the perspective of springtime. So I want to begin with speaking for you a poem that I love to do for this season. And I dearly love to have a group of students in a live eurythmy class and do this as a group experience in eurythmy. It's such a lively and moving poem. It's by someone named Charles Austin. I don't know much about him. It's about 12 lines long, somewhat modern, and so the flow of the poem is not standardly formal, like the Hopkins poem is, which is in a sonnet. And this poem is called Whole, as in this way of acclaiming spirit, which we know from the Native American people in the sauna, in the powwow. If someone says something that needs to be affirmed, then people might say, "Ho," that was right. The poem is called Ho. And at the end of the poem, well, first, the poem is about wind, and it is in praise of the wind of spring, which we often have at Easter time or in March, but which is carrying us through the springtime season. And at the end of the poem, and I tell you that now to prepare you for what you're listening for, at the end of the poem, it says, this is death of death wind. So that which is coming to us in springtime is the death of death wind, the Christ wind, alive, oh, come. So let me speak it for you and fill your ears with imagination for this exciting little journey. Oh, this is the wind of spring. This is blood wind, sap wind, swan wind, joy wind, wiping the sky slate gleam. Come, at last cleanser, come, if late purifier, weep aside, wipe out winter cold, cobwebbed. Ah, bring us young wind, reviver, reborn wind, redeemer, resurrection wind, death of death wind, Christ wind alive. Ah, come. Can you imagine doing that in a eurythmic class? Blowing through the space with your classmates, creating wind forms, wind currents. So here we are, death of death wind, resurrection wind, Christ wind alive. In these days of springtime, we are living in the atmosphere of the days after Easter. And as I've said to you before, I'm sure, or I hope, that where you are, unless you're in the southern hemisphere, you're living with this abundance of upsurging forces. And in this time, between Easter and Ascension, we hold the picture of the disciples walking with Christ or learning from Christ in his presence. And what we are going to hear, what we must behold in this time, is that the disciples were not in a wide awake consciousness in this phase. They were almost in a trance stage in this phase because their minds were not yet awakened enough to understand what they were experiencing. So we're cycling towards that in the course of this talk. Let's go back a little bit and look at what we've learned in the last week. And already 2 weeks, I spoke about some thoughts that Rudolf Steiner brought from the 5th Gospel lectures, in which he speaks about the incarnation process of Christ. So from our times in December, we studied about the 2 Jesus children, the body of the Nathan child, which was pure and untouched, carried none of the so-called sickness of sin in the bodily nature, very pure, a pure astral body, etheric body, physical body, and really no ego presence, just a vessel ready to receive an ego. And then at the age of 12, we remember the Zarathustra ego, the beingness of a high initiate came and overshadowed and infused himself and partly incarnated into this Jesus child for 18 years until in a time of profound crisis, the Zarathustra being said, the earth mysteries, the sacred mysteries are exhausted. The life forces of the planet have come to an end. The great gods are no longer coming to the altars of the people. I don't know what to do. And in a very beautifully described conversation with his mother, Mary, he poured out his heart. In that moment, the spirits of the 2 Jesus children grew very close and then left the body, and almost in a trance, you remember this story, almost in a trance, this Jesus child, or in a shell, an empty shell, said, I must give everything away. Everything. There is no choice but to serve my Creator. And went to the River Jordan, where John the Baptist was baptizing people, and underwent his baptism. And there, Rudolf Steiner speaks quite beautifully that for Christ, the baptism was the conception moment. That means that Christ was not able to fully embody himself immediately. And I want you to try to make sense out of that statement. Christ, huge, huge as the entire universe, loftier than any being we can imagine, lofty as God is lofty, huge as the whole cosmos. How could he condense himself into a human body? And it was only in this process of 3 years of incarnating that he was able to be born, essentially. And that's once again, Rudolf Steiner surprises us by saying, if the baptism was a conception, then from that time until the mystery of Golgotha, he was getting ready to be born onto the earth. Does that mean sinking in, integrating his lofty spirit into the nerve system, into the organs of the body, into the limbs, or perhaps the other way, but just coming to nestle into a body. And then the birth was the death on the cross, which we must make an effort to understand how that could be, that being born into the body also signifies a disappearance from the spiritual world. And Christ died into the body in being born through death, the death of the crucifixion. It's a huge picture. And then the 40 days, which we are passing through now, every year we meet its equivalent in the 40 days that corresponds to his actual earth life after the mystery of Golgotha, where Christ was in contact with the apostles when they were in another state of consciousness. And then at the time of ascension, which will happen 2 weeks from today, the anniversary of that, Christ disappears into spirit, and that corresponds to our death and our continued life in the astral world and in Devaka and spirit land. We'll talk more about that then when we get to it. But so in today's contemplation, once again, we're going to look at these mysteries of springtime, remembering what we've looked at more than once, that by following the journey of nature, the journey of the seasons, including how they are described in the calendar of the soul verses, we get to know the life body of Christ, because he, through this process of incarnation, completely connected himself with the life body of the earth. So let's consider that a little bit. And let's begin by just thinking of how in ancient times people experienced themselves as the recipients of the cosmic creative process, and people experienced the seasons as they affected them from without. So when the snow was falling onto the earth, snowflakes, and they covered the earth, people would feel that they were beginning to get cut off from God. The planet Earth and their home were losing this majesty of nature, and they were drawing into cold and dark places. And then when light came and spring came, with nature, they rejoiced. Their inner lives were largely changed from external forces by the changing light and warmth of the seasons. And surely I can understand that. I'm affected by the change of the seasons. Nonetheless, something has had to change. We do that differently now, because what was the outer drama, since the life and death of Christ has now become our inner weather. And so we have winter and spring and summer and fall. We have all of that in ourselves, and we can experience all those seasons at any time. What I'm really, with very few words, trying to engender as us is this realization of how, with the event of Christ's life and death, the whole cosmos had to be renewed, had to be changed, and we were given the possibility of not dying with the dying forces of the earth. I'll come and talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. We had to be given the spark of resurrection inside each one of us. Oh, let's stay with springtime. So we have this color, these wonderful colors, the fragrance and the bird songs. We have the expansion, we have the fertility of nature. We have birds making nests and lambs being born and frolicking on the fields. And we all know what that's like. And in his lectures on the seasons, Rudolf Steiner describes this. It's the chemical of sulfur. The sulfur is the force that manifests the power of upsurging, burning warmth. And he speaks of how earth, as it explodes out of seed into manifestation in colors and etheric oils and all, the earth expands back into the heights. And in autumn, the other side of the year, Michael has to come in and say, earth forces, I command you to retreat, to go back into the earth, because it's time for the earth to rest and for the dragon, the sulfur forces of the dragon, to be subdued, to stay in the earth. And that is the archetype of Michael fighting the dragon as revealed in the cycle of the seasons. And let's be aware, remember in our first talk here, we had a couple of visitors from New Zealand. I don't know if they still listen, maybe to the recordings, I don't know. But they asked, what about in the southern hemisphere? What does it mean that we have Easter in the fall? And let's think about, what do we have in the fall with this Michaelic, where the sulfur forces are being subdued. And it's the exact counterpole to the sulfur forces rising in springtime. When Rudolf Steiner teaches us how to think about that, he says these rising forces are connected with above the archangel Raphael, the archangel of healing, and on the other side of the planet, and that's a very important picture, on the right now for us, down there, all the way through the earth, in the dark places of the southern hemisphere, we have the complementary pole. So the totality is always present. If Raphael's on top, then Michael, the Lord of the autumn, is active in the bottom. And so if in the totality of the earth, we have the light pole, the resurrection forces, and down below, we have the forces that are getting ready to go into the darkness of winter. And together, we have a complete picture of life and death in what's happening on the planet. And as Rudolf Steiner says, when we are in autumn, this is a gift for those who are in the southern hemisphere, but it's also mindfulness for us. When we're in autumn, our meditative picture is Christ is resurrected. He resurrects at springtime. Therefore, we can be safely laid in the grave, meaning we can safely go into wintertime. We'll be fine. We have been given the gift of the resurrection. And he says that the words, the meditation of Raphael is, Christ has been laid in the grave in autumn, and therefore we know we will be resurrected. So we have these polarities, Raphael and Michael. So let's continue. Springtime. As I said, I have no more springtime here. We already have autumn, or the hotness of the sulfur process is already burning my world here up, unfortunately. Brown, 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 brown. Or if I'm romantic, golden fields of dying grasses. But where you have spring. The leaves, there's nothing so beautiful as the leaves of spring and the flowers. The world that has been bare and dark is growing beautiful again, and joy can be felt, heard in the birds, and seen in the colors. Think of the spring green, delicate colors of the leaves. They're delicate. And later, the leaves will no longer have this delicate beauty. The leaves almost look like flowers at this season, the way that they so tenderly unfold in the light. It's almost as if they're light beings just barely touching matter. And later, as they grow bigger, they become coarser, they become thicker. They don't become more beautiful. They become less beautiful. They become heavy. Their beauty has just declined. The flowers, the leaves are like flowers now, and the blossoms essentially are beings of pure color, only just touching the world of materiality in the petals. But these petals would just as soon evaporate in front of us. And these are where the elemental beings are playing, just touching, just kissing nature. And these spring flowers are so fragrant. In the sulfur process, they give off their fragrances in the etheric oils that many of us use as remedies. And there is no being of all the kingdoms of nature, no kingdom reveals its divine nature as much as the flowers do, especially in springtime. So we think of a crystal, however beautiful a crystal is, it is really just the memory of what it used to be millions and gazillion years ago when it was pure light. But it's not growing anymore. It's a memory of its divine shape. And animals, they are also constricted by their bodies and the years of life of waking and sleeping and dying. And as for we humans, oh my goodness, we cannot show our core being to one another, not on the earth. And it takes ever so much for us to get anywhere near to the core being of another person on the earth. But flowers in their whole appearance, their delicacy, their fragrance, they're a clear reflection, a clear manifestation of what they are in the divine world, under the eyes of God. Just light, woven barely, tenderly into matter. We see God and the spiritual beings and all the elemental beings when we behold their beauty. So have you filled your minds with that gorgeousness? It is in that season of springtime when the world is most transparent for the divine world. Let's just hold that for a minute. How perfect that this is the time in which we can contemplate and behold the mysteries of resurrection, of life appearing again in matter, after the long time of winter. And then with the coming of summer, the plants lose part of their transparency. And isn't that a bit of a reflection of our human lives? In that in childhood, our bodies were light, probably, and we were agile and how easily we could run and skip and tumble and somersault and laugh and feel the joy of creation. Hopefully, we were all granted many, many seasons like that when we were children. And then when adolescence comes and we start to feel the heaviness of hormones, and then when adulthood comes and we have to feel responsibility, and my goodness, with the decade that I have, my joints start to hurt, right? And it's harder to climb a mountain, etc., etc. I no longer have spring in my body. I carry the first signs of the heaviness of death in my body. And we all do that. With the coming of summer, also the plants lose part of their transparency. The heaviness of the earth begins to weight them down. And the light that they've received from above begins to become dense as it lives in this darkness of gravity. So take a moment, please, to visualize that. Imagine in your mind's eye, don't let me do all the thinking for you, but imagine in your mind's eye a plant, your plant, growing out of seed into leaf, from leaf upwards, delicate flowers, delicate leaves, almost like flowers, buds opening, grateful in their plant-like way to the sun, and in full trust opening. Do you see your flower? You see that lesson that it teaches us about creation. And then what happens? And then the plant's going to change. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. But we cannot live, and the plants cannot live forever in springtime. We have to separate. In our lives, we know that summer has to give way to autumn. Death is a reality. And I'm going to weave that together with the plants as we get there. What happens to the plants in summer and at ascension? But let's weave a few parts of the story into that. Summer, as it gives way to autumn, is dealing with the forces of death, the forces of gravity, the forces of age. And for us, of course, death is a loss of vitality. And for us, death also means separation. And for us, death makes consciousness possible. And then we realize, become mindful, no other of the spiritual beings have known death. This was Christ's task. This was the task of Christ. And what does it mean to overcome death? If all the beings of the hierarchies were meant to be omniscient, to know everything as an immediate reality, and here in this human kingdom, there appeared something that they couldn't understand. Why is the human being disappearing from us in death? And Christ came to re-enliven or reweave and reintegrate humanity into the cosmic order. And so we remember how in the previous class we've worked so hard to speak of how Christ's deed was to resurrect, to save the human phantom, the human physical body, the archetype of the physical body. Those powers which are formative, that are able to take hold of materiality and make materiality coalesce into a physical body. Difficult thought, but we've worked on it for a couple of weeks. Let me know if you want to go more deeply into it again and again. It's so important. But the forces that Christ would hold on to through death were the forces of spirit that belong to the physical body, the architectural forces that were able to hold, coalesce matter into the form of the physical body and release it at will. And that's everything to do with the future stages of humanity and what we're all going to go through, right? But Christ rescued the human forces. Now, let's remember, in getting ready for the next step, we have spoken about the human being has the ego, the astral body, the etheric body, and the physical. And the physical is the oldest, the big brother of the four, maybe 4 years old, if you will. And the etheric body is the next oldest, in that case, 3 years old. Just we imagine a child, a 3-year-old child, trying to boss the 4-year-old child who's already getting a bit stuck in his ways. The astral body is the 2-year-old child, if you will. We can just use these words this time. And the 2-year-old child is the one who says no and has tantrums, a little mischief maker. That's our astral body. Hard to tame, not very mature yet. And the ego is the infant in us. And the ego is where the healing needs to take place in us. And Christ is working to empower us to have this health. But to do that, Christ is going to have to, we've talked about this, bring healing to all 4 levels. And so now we begin to look at the deed of Christ, who is now reappearing in the etheric world also, and will, in many thousands of years, have another resurrection and appearance in the astral world, and then in the ego realm. And this will all happen before the end of Earth evolution, before the whole Earth dissolves, and that which can return to spirit will, and that which can't return to spirit will have a further bondage to matter in states of unfreedom. But we've spoken a bit about that before. That topic belongs a bit more to Michaelmas. So in the course of his time being a human being, one of the beautiful events in Christ's life was the event of the Transfiguration. And those of you who are familiar with this story know the Transfiguration. And I'd like to stick with that for a moment. I've hesitated to bring it yet because, well, what was the Transfiguration? At a certain time in Christ's life, he was able to manifest on the earth in his entire divine body, and 3 of the disciples were able to behold it happening. Not all of them, but 3 of them were able to behold it happening. And I would like to read you a description of that. It'll take about 4 minutes for me to read it to you, but I believe I've told you before of a wonderful book. I'm going to put the name in the chat. It's called The Fifth Gospel. And those of you who have worked with Steiner's work know that Rudolf Steiner, in his esoteric research, explored the life of Christ in the 18 years from the event in the 12-year-old event in the temple up until the baptism, and then a bit beyond. And he calls this the fifth gospel, and it's from his research reading the Akashic record. And then that lecture series is called The Fifth Gospel or From the Fifth Gospel. And a bold anthroposophist named Adriana Pugliese has written a novel by that name. Oh, I wrote the last name wrong. Excuse me. Adri. Let me try one more. Adriana Pugliese. There you go. And the book is a novel written in the form of a novel, which tells the story of Christ. I must say, I was a little skeptical whether that was going to work or not, and I find it an incredibly successfully written story, and so true to the picture that Rudolf Steiner gave. And I really invite you to read it. It's, gosh, what is it, 350 pages long? Very engaging story. But I'd like to read how she talks about the transfiguration. So let this come alive in your inner imagination. I'll try to read it in a very living way so that you will be able to imagine these pictures as you hear them. So he talks about Jesus the man, and he says, Christ the man in his relationship to the body that he's living in. Since he had come into Jesus, starting with those words, do you know where that is? Since Christ had come into Jesus, Christ had grown accustomed to the increasing burden of the human heart, to the organs of the body speaking to him of pain and suffering, to the solidity under his feet, to the weight of the body, and also to the sharp thoughts that pricked at his spirit. Is that wonderful? Can you imagine God going, what is this that I'm living in? And my mind has got thoughts and my feet. Yeah. Now, several years into the process, the world no longer clawed at his senses or pierced into him like a dagger. Outwardly, he was now composed and quiet, and sometimes he was able to be that man of Nazareth whom everybody knew and spoke to. He was a man who seemed simple and kind and laughed at the childish ways of his disciples, a man who gave his friends riddles to solve and who sometimes listened politely to the insults of the rabbis and the doubts of the people. He was becoming one with that man, Jesus, that body. Yet inwardly, he was also a God, an exalted being who had come down from beyond the stars to be poured into an earthly mold. A God with a task was never far from his mind. That's already a great first paragraph, isn't it? You know, to imagine what Christ's experience was in becoming man. To ponder this, he would sometimes take himself away from people, away from their questions, away from the grasping, their lack of understanding, and their stubborn ways. And he would receive solace then, not only for his spirit, but for his body also, since at the same time, his spirit communed with his Father in heaven. His body was rejuvenated by the angels on earth, even as all human bodies are rejuvenated in sleep. And he was happy for it while it lasted. You see that picture? Christ healing the body, and then at least sometimes I can pull back and be with the angels sleeping. But he knew that his body was unlike other human bodies. In the past, men had been overshone by those angels and gods who had inspired them. But no God had ever entered into the blood and bones of a man. No God had ever died an earthly death, but this was his task. And he did not know if the body of Jesus would be capable of withstanding the immense power of his Spirit to the very end, or if that body would be torn asunder prematurely before he could perform his duty. Even now, things were altering. He could sense it. The deeper he entered into flesh and bones, the more those abilities that impressed the people had begun to fade. And he knew that a time was close by when his body would be seen outwardly as old and wasted and incapable of producing miracles of any kind. And he would be mocked as powerless and feeble. Would his chosen disciples remain faithful to him? But on this day, he had taken the 12 to the mountain, and of the 12, 3 had been able to awaken in the night, and they had seen what happens to him in the night. And to them, he said, awaken, awaken, and behold the spirit of creation, its beginning, its center, and its end. I am the cause of the east and the west, of the north and the south. I am the cause of all that is in the heights above and in the depths below. I am truth itself. I am revelation. I am knowledge. I am piety. I am the law. I am almighty. Can you imagine actually seeing the Almighty in a body? Oh, we have to shake ourselves awake to be able to have such a grand picture. And among this brilliance that they saw, legions of spirit, a multitude of elemental beings of water and air and fire and earth, they awakened to see him and to answer his call. Moses and Elijah came too, to stand beside his outspread arms. And thus it was that between the way and the truth of Elijah and Moses, between the stars and the earth, he shone like a vermilion sun, a splendor that would not be seen again until his resurrection. This was his gift to the world of the elements, his gift to his chosen one. This was a vision of his true ethereal person, of the light and the love and the life that would not only renew nature itself, but would also sustain his disciples in the coming difficult months ahead, when his body outwardly aged and his health inclined towards death. Such a vivid picture, isn't it? I could only recommend that you read the book because her writing is like this all the way through. And yes, I have waited to bring this picture of the transformation because it actually belongs to the time of telling the biography of Jesus as a man on the earth. But already in that moment, that night of the transfiguration, the spirit body, which Christ indwells now, was made visible in advance for people. And they were able to see him. And so the body was growing older. He was succumbing to death. He was carrying death and the aches and pains of his body, which could not sustain the fire of his being. And then he was crucified. And in the talk last week, I quoted this wonderful picture that Rudolf Steiner gives, that the moment when the blood flowed into the earth. The aura of the earth became light, lit up. And if one looked at the earth from far distances and over long periods of time, one would have seen that at the time of the blood of the crucifixion, the whole aura of the earth changed magnificently and became a light giver. That's the beginning of the process of our earth becoming the sun, this astral radiance. In that immediate time, Christ then on Holy Saturday entered the realm of the dead. What is that? Christ. We learn that at that time in history, many people were getting lost after death. They didn't have this inner light, not even the light that you and I carry. They didn't have the light to be able to keep sustaining their existence after death. And in the Holy Creed of the Christian community, it says, he overcame death after 3 days. In the time after death, he became the helper of the souls of the dead who had lost their divine nature. Then he overcame death. What is interesting here, and I can't make a long diversion into that today, but we will have to touch that. Maybe I'll get to it still a little bit tonight. But we face the same crisis now, that there are many people who cannot find their way after death. And I've spoken of that before. Those people who don't have a knowledge of spirit and who are so addicted to materialism, they cannot find their way after death. And we have to talk more about that later. And then, so Christ helped them. It is told also in the stories of, I guess, the Catholic Church. As I said, I'm not raised Catholic, but there are pictures of him opening the graves and the dead pouring forth out of the grave. But what that means is that sources of light came to them after or with the resurrection. And then we have the Holy Sunday. And then in the course of the next 40 days, there were many stories, both in the Bible and also anecdotally, of Christ being with the disciples after his death for 40 days. And in what I said in the beginning, Christ's death, the deed of Golgotha, is the beginning of what corresponds to his earthly life, when he was walking in the body that he had given form to, the resurrected phantom body, the saved physical body. He was walking in that body for 40 days. That was his earthly life, different from ours. But his ego, as I've been trying to say, was not fully into the Jesus ego, the Jesus body, until the hours of the crucifixion. He was still in the process of condensing himself into that Jesus body. But at the time of the death and the resurrection, he had entered fully, and then he made this new body, the phantom body, and he walked the earth for 40 days in that body. And then during those days, the apostles lived in his presence. And they experienced a springtime, like our springtime, like your springtime, not mine in California, the springtime of the Spirit. During those times, they were hiding from the Romans and those Jews who wanted to seek them out. They didn't like this sect of Christians. They were hiding in the upper room, which was the place of the Last Supper. And in that time, they were aware that the risen one, Christ, was with them. And the light and power of his resurrection shone all around them like a sun. Now try to enliven that thought in yourself. Think now of the flowers open to the sun and what they are able to become, petals of beauty and fragrance and pure revelations of spirit. And the disciples now had the God's Son with them, and something new was taking fruit in the disciples. They could see their teacher, their master, as they had never seen him before. The light and the power of the resurrection all around him. In this body that he had made, he could be touched, he could eat, and he could teach them. And it is said that he taught them so much in that time, but they felt that they were in a dream. They didn't even know. They didn't have self-reflection. It wasn't until after Whitsun that they were able to wake up and say, we have been dreaming. We were dreaming for 3 years, but especially in these 40 days, we can remember that we were with Christ, but we were dreaming. We weren't cognizing. We were lifted into another realm. They lived in his presence, and they had received from him the wisdom of the world of God that he had come from. And they felt through him. They felt the grandeur of the zodiac, the stars, and they felt the sun power, and they felt like the plants do when the sun shines upon them. They felt truth and life. They felt the light and love, even as the kings and the shepherds did at the time of the birth of the child. So after 40 days, something will change. So let's anticipate then what's next. After 40 days, in springtime, the blossoms will fade, the petals will fall away. Why? Because the plant has to take a new step, has to work with the earth forces. And the plant then has to bring forth its seed. And it cannot bring forth seed if it's still plant or flower, giving itself up. The plant is going to have to be fertilized by the Christ sun or the sky sun, and then close itself up into an inner challenge where the seed can grow. This is a natural rhythm. And first, many plants will make a fruit. And in the fruit, there's a sweetness, probably not in all of them, but the earthly nature of the plant begins to happen. Instead of giving away the fragrance, the fruit begins to hold flavor. The fragrance now becomes more attached to matter. The heavenly becomes more apparent in the fruit. And then the fruit contains the seed of the new growth, the next generation. The flower, which is the beauty that we live in springtime, can go no further. It was a celebration, but it can go no further. It needs seeds, and it must fade for the sake of what is to come next. And the flowering of the 40 days when the disciples were with Christ had to change into fruiting so that Christ's seed could become fruit. Another beautiful picture of the hearts of the apostles were the place where the new seed could be formed. And the apostles had to themselves become the outer covering of the seeds of the future, quickened by the light and the love. And this could only happen, and this is anticipating Whitsun, could only happen when the immediate presence of the risen one left. because as long as they were in the overwhelming blessing presence of the Spirit, they could not themselves become seeds. They had to be able to draw into themselves at Whitsun and feel completely newborn themselves. So the risen one at the ascension, which we'll see soon, drew away, left, and so the hearts could no longer be absorbed entirely in what shone upon them from outside, and so that looking inside, they could find the seed given to them. And that which was given has been given to the entire earth, to all human beings who look for it. And it's the gift for the whole earth. We all take part in it. But of course, it doesn't mean that we have all been, so to speak, saved, so to speak, because it also means that the trials of life on earth is becoming our path of progress, of suffering and struggle to become wise and to move towards the new human state, the new human condition. But on the way, we can use this meditative guideline of Christ where he says, I am the way and the truth and the life. He is the sun. So in springtime, we see the world of the Spirit face to face in the flowers, in creation. And afterwards, we have to find it in ourselves through earthly life. And that's where we learn through the biography and through our suffering. So we must understand the mystery of Golgotha itself as an earthly birth. As interesting as that thought is, the mystery of Golgotha is when Christ connects with the body. And the death of Jesus as the earthly birth and the life of Christ is in the earthly sphere since the ascension. Or since Pentecost, we can compare with what that means in the spirit land after death. And Christ's life continues. And so let's also just briefly anticipate where we will be going, that the forces we know that in our time, as this Christ story continues, we do indeed live in a very difficult time now. Since the beginning of the consciousness soul, the 1400s, the time of increasing materialism, when the Lord of Darkness, Ahriman, is doing more and more to attack the human spirit. And on the other side, Christ is reappearing in the etheric. This is the event that started in the 1930s and something that increasingly in our millennium, human beings must develop the capacity to see Christ in the etheric. We'll talk more about that. We've also looked at that in previous studies. To see Christ in the etheric, and Ahriman, who has completely different intentions for world intelligence and humanity, will do everything he can to keep us from perceiving Christ in the etheric. He cannot stop Christ from appearing in the etheric, but it would be a tragedy for the entire cosmic creation if human beings don't recognize Christ in the etheric. So just a short glance at that, Steiner says, when we, enough humans, must be able to discern Christ in the etheric before Ahriman's incarnation. That's essential. And what Ahriman is going to try to do is to create, he calls them quick shortcuts towards clairvoyance. He doesn't go into specific details, but he'll offer to humanity possibilities of having super sensible experiences without doing any inner work. we see a little bit of that, a little bit. We see the equivalence of telepathy in the telephone. We see the equivalence of the spiritual work of imagination in movies and television and in screen time. We see all these artificial bypasses around that are taking us away from actually taking hold of our own forces of spiritual presence in our mind, in our hearts, in our deeds. And one of the reasons I just love to do these podcasts and work on these is to state these truths in the world. We can do this, but we must really make an effort, because the stakes for all of humanity, for all of the earth, are really great. Christ will appear in our time, is appearing in the etheric body. We'll talk more about that next week. It's different from the risen body. It's another level, the etheric body. There's the risen body, which happened at Easter, and there's the reappearance of Christ in the etheric, which is happening now. And in several thousand years, the reappearance in the astral world, and then in the ego world. And Ahriman wants to do whatever he can to keep us from seeing that. And yet, yes, Christ is always there. He's always with us, if we can only pursue the question of how can we see him? How can we do that? And when we have our ascension consideration in 2 weeks, we'll go more deeply into how Christ has really united himself with the earth. But I'd like to end today's talk by speaking the verse of the turning point of time that many of you know, and I hope that you've all seen and worked with the eurythmic form that I've created for that for solo practice at home. But it speaks about the turning point of time when Christ entered this world. So let me speak it for us. At the turning point of time, the spirit light of the world entered the earthly stream of being. Darkness of night had held its sway. Day, radiant light shone forth in human souls. Light that gives warmth to simple shepherds' hearts. Light that enlightens the wise heads of kings. Light divine, Christ Son, warm our hearts, enlighten our heads, that good may become what from our hearts we are founding, and from our heads we direct with focused will, or with single purpose. Thank you. Now, in closing, let me just say we will have 2 more classes on May 29th, I believe, and on June, that would be 8th, I believe, or 7th or something. And I'm also starting a new 4-part webinar series. We'll begin it next Tuesday. This last webinar, Eurythmy series we've done, has dealt with the planets, and this new upcoming series is with the constellations. This will be the final Eurythmy series for this 9-month period from last September. We might have a smaller mini series in the summer, but I'm beginning my travel summer soon. So I'm wrapping it up with these considerations of the risen Christ and these considerations of planets and constellations. So You can look for the announcement. Registration for the webinar is open now, and I'll include the link in tonight's email. Thank you so much for taking part, Michelle. As always, thank you for co-hosting, and thank you, dear friends, for your donations, which make it all possible. I couldn't do it without that.